Think back. You're 6 years old. A bell rings, and you file into a room with 30 other kids your exact age. You sit in a chair. You face the front. You raise your hand to speak. An adult you've never met tells you when to talk, when to eat, when you're allowed to stand up and go to the bathroom. This is normal. This is childhood. It's what a child is for. Except it isn't. Not for almost any child who ever lived. For 300,000 years, basically the entire history of our species, not one child on Earth did a single thing you just pictured. No classrooms, no grades, no homework, no bedtime, no schedule, no lessons, no tests. That same 6-year-old wasn't sitting in a chair being taught. She was a mile from camp, digging her own breakfast out of the ground, holding a knife, with no adult watching her at all. So what did ancient children actually do all day? The answer sounds, at first, a lot like neglect, and by the end, it might make you wonder whether we're the ones who got childhood wrong. Let's start with the thing that's missing, because it's almost everything. There was no school, but it runs deeper than that. There was no children's world at all, no separate zone where kids were parked to be kids while the adults went off to do the real things. No playroom, no toy aisle, no birthday parties, no age grades, no big kid table. Picture the camp, 25, maybe 30 people. Everyone sleeping within arm's reach of everyone else. The adults only work a few hours a day, so nobody is desperate to get the children out from underfoot. And here's the small fact that quietly rewires the whole thing. In a group that size, there are almost never two children the same age. A 4-year-old has no other 4-year-olds to pair off with, so she runs with the 9-year-olds, and the toddlers, and the 12-year-olds, all in one roaming pack. Mixed ages. Remember that. It's the hinge the whole story turns on. Because one American psychologist spent years figuring out exactly what that does to a child, and what he found flips everything we assume about how kids are supposed to grow. His name is Peter Gray, a researcher at Boston College. Around 2013, he did something nobody had bothered to do. He gathered up decades of reports from anthropologists who'd actually lived in hunter-gatherer camps and asked them all one simple question: what do the children do? The answers came back so consistent it was almost eerie. Hunter-gatherer children, they said, played. Not for an hour after chores, all day. From the moment they woke until they dropped off to sleep, essentially free, doing whatever they wanted, with almost no adult steering them at all. And the adults? They didn't feel any need to fill that time. Nobody scheduled it. Nobody enriched it. The whole attitude toward a child was something close to total trust, the flat assumption that a kid, left alone to explore, would turn into a competent adult on her own. Gray calls it trustful parenting, and it wasn't rare. It was the human default for longer than farming has even existed. But here's the strange part. This wasn't idle, empty play. Watch what those children actually chose to do with all that freedom, and it's uncanny. The boys whittled tiny bows and shot at lizards and grasshoppers. The girls carried little digging sticks and pulled up real tubers beside their mothers. They built miniature huts. They played at tracking, at starting fires, at butchering a kill, at carrying and soothing babies. They were rehearsing, in play, the exact skills that would keep them alive as adults, and not one grown-up made them do it. David Lancy, an anthropologist at Utah State, gave this a name. He'd studied childhood across dozens of traditional societies, and he kept noticing the same thing. Children learned the entire skill set of their culture without ever being formally taught it. He called it the Chore Curriculum. The classroom was the whole camp, running all day, in plain sight, and the child simply absorbed it. And it gets stranger, because in these communities, adults almost never sat a child down to teach. No lessons, no drills, barely even any correcting. Lancy found the arrow pointed the other way. It was the child's job to watch, to hover at the edge of the adult's work and pick it up by copying. A kid who wanted to learn to make an arrow didn't get a lesson. She got a front row seat for years and a small blade of her own to try it with. Lancy even had a blunt phrase for how these children were treated compared to ours, not the center of attention. Loved, fed, kept close, but not fussed over. Not managed, not the little sun the whole household orbits. And yes, an actual blade. This is where the modern parent flinches. Barry Hewlett, an anthropologist at Washington State, spent decades with the Aka foragers of Central Africa. He documented something that would end a modern playdate on the spot. Aka infants, babies barely able to walk, were handed knives, allowed to grab hot coals near the fire, left to explore the edge of real danger, and the adults simply watched, unbothered. To the Aka, snatching those things away would have been the bizarre choice. A person learns to handle a blade by handling a blade. The freedom wasn't carelessness. The freedom was the education. And it worked. Which brings us to the part that truly short-circuits the modern brain. These free-roaming, unschooled, knife-wielding children weren't only playing, they were working, really working, feeding themselves and the camp. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, one of the last hunting and gathering peoples left on Earth, children start foraging almost as soon as they can walk steadily. Alyssa Crittenden, who has studied Hadza kids for years, found that by 3 or 4 they're already out gathering, and by 5 or 6, a Hadza child can pull a real chunk of her own calories out of the bush. Berries, baobab pods, tubers she digs herself and cracks open with a rock. In some measures, up to half of what she eats in a day, she found and dug and processed on her own. Nicholas Blurton Jones, who tracked Hadza children for decades at UCLA, clocked kids walking real distances and coming home genuinely fed by their own hands. Sit with that number for a second. Half, a 5-year-old, feeding herself. Now hold it up against the world you actually know, where a healthy 10-year-old often can't make a sandwich unsupervised, where children are driven, escorted, chaperoned, and scheduled from the second they open their eyes, and where simply letting a 6-year-old leave the yard alone is something a parent could get reported for. The rest of a young child's food came from a surprising place. Not the father's. They were off hunting, and most days they came home with nothing. Grandmothers. Kristen Hawkes at the University of Utah showed that older women, well past menopause and still walking miles a day to dig tubers, were often the most dependable providers in the whole camp. Her grandmother hypothesis argues those tireless feeding grandmothers are the very reason humans can wean children early and stack babies close together. So the child's astonishing freedom was, in part, bought and paid for by her grandmother. It really did take a whole camp to raise one kid, not as a slogan, as calories. And the children governed themselves too. In that mixed-age pack, the older kids taught the younger ones, broke up their own squabbles, and practiced caring for the little ones long before they had babies of their own. A toddler who fell was scooped up by an 8-year-old. A question got answered by a cousin. No adult refereeing required. Psychologists have a fancy phrase for what a younger child gets from an older one, a live example of the next thing she's about to be able to do. But the kids had been running that classroom on their own for a few 100,000 years before anyone thought to study it. So where did the deeper stuff come from? The myths, the morals, the map of who your people are. Mostly, the fire. Polly Wiesner, an anthropologist who recorded conversations among the Juhauhansi Bushmen, found something clean and beautiful. Daytime talk was practical and often prickly. Food, arguments, who did what. But after dark, around the flames, roughly 4/5 of it turned into stories. Tales of distant relatives, old hunts, spirits, the ancestors. That firelight hour was the closest thing an ancient child had to a lesson, and it never once felt like one. She just lay in the dark, warm, listening, and soaked up an entire culture through her skin. And here's where the whole picture turns over. By every instinct of modern parenting, what I've just described is a disaster. Unsupervised toddlers with knives. 6-year-olds wandering miles from home. No teachers, no lessons, no schedule, no one confirming that any child is safe, or learning, or on track. If someone raised a kid this way on your street tomorrow, you might call the authorities. We look straight at it and see neglect. But now look at what it produced. Not broken, anxious, helpless people. It produced adults so capable they could feed, shelter, and defend themselves from raw landscape with their bare hands. The very same adults that every visiting researcher, over and over, described as strikingly calm, confident, and content. Then, turn the mirror around. Our childhood, the scheduled, supervised, tested, indoor, screen-lit, endlessly managed one, is not the natural, safe, obvious way to grow a human. It's a brand new experiment, a few generations old, running head-on against 300,000 years of the exact opposite. And Peter Gray thinks the experiment is failing. Over the past 50 years, as free, unsupervised play has quietly drained out of childhood, rates of anxiety and depression in young people have climbed, by some measures 5 to 8 times higher than they were back in the 1950s. Gray doesn't think that's a coincidence. He argues a child needs unsupervised freedom the way she needs food, the space to take real risks, to solve her own problems, to feel genuinely in charge of her own life. Strip it away, and something in her never quite finishes forming. You can even watch the freedom vanish on a map. Researchers who traced 4 generations of a single English family found that where a great-grandfather at 8 had roamed 6 miles from home, alone, to go fishing, the 8-year-old of today was allowed to the end of the street, a few hundred feet. In roughly 100 years, a child's whole world shrank from miles to yards. We didn't decide that on purpose. It just happened, one careful choice at a time. So the next time you picture an ancient child, filthy, unschooled, miles from any adult, a blade in one hand and a dug-up root in the other, try not to feel sorry for her. She wasn't deprived. She was doing precisely what 300,000 years of being human built a child to do. She was free in a way almost no child alive today will ever get to be. We told ourselves we were protecting our kids. We filled their hours, tracked their every step, cleared away every risk and every empty, boring, unwatched afternoon, and we called it love. Maybe it is, but some part of them still runs on the old design, still needs the woods, the pack of other kids, the long, unsupervised day, the terrifying privilege of being trusted with something sharp. We are still those children. We just don't let ourselves be them anymore. So here's the question worth sitting with. If a child raised with almost nothing, no school, no schedule, no one watching, somehow grew up steadier than ours do, then what exactly have we been handing our children all this time? And what did we quietly take from them to do it?